Enriching lives through learning is a beautiful motto on which this school runs. However, this claim brings us a deeper, ever-present question of what is the best way to educate and nurture our students so that they can be successful. Over the last 4 years, I've had the fabulous experience to learn from many of the teachers in this room and be part of the school community here at Taroona High School, as I've been supported to strive to the best of my ability. Throughout all of our own individual learning journeys, we begin to better understand ourselves as learners and what we require to be at our best. A theme I've begun to see in my own learning is that I thrive when content is made relatable and applicable to the real world. In my experience and understanding of fellow students, this is echoed as a common important theme in their learning also. Now, this is an idea that you would have heard before. Nonetheless, I believe that it is important to be reminded of and understand firsthand how something so simple can benefit students of various capabilities. Having learning relatable and applicable makes a difference for students for a few key reasons. School is a whirlwind of information fed to us, and it can be difficult to remember everything or understand where different knowledge fits. Understanding the cognitive functions of our brain helps us understand the process of memory and learning for these students. Put simply, the more neural pathways we create between different information in our brain, the better we remember it. Meaning the more links we can make to students' current knowledge, the more neural pathways we can create, and the better they can remember content. And quite obviously, learning isn't much use to us if we can't remember it. Furthermore, in addition to simply recalling information, learning is only able to enrich our lives if we can actively apply it to our lives. However, sometimes for students, it can be really difficult to work out on your own why some learning is important or applicable beyond a test. Which is why it is so important that how learning is actively applied is presented by a teacher. Now, there are a few key ways that we can make learning applicable for students. Let's discuss just 4 of these. These 4 ways to relate learning content is to relate it to passions and interests of students, create interdisciplinary links, link it to current world events, and finally, apply it to a student's future. Firstly, let's talk about relating learning to students' passions and personal interests. Most of schooling revolves around 4 standard curricular areas of humanities, English, maths, and science. But unfortunately, these don't interest everyone. In the health and wellness curriculum, there's been a focus on finding one's own passion and really what lights you up and makes you excited. This means that students in classes were participating and sharing what they found interesting and were passionate about. And we heard everything from kids liking mountain biking to being really interested in cosmetics and much more. Although our passions are all unique, they're important to us and are an easy access point to which we can focus learning and make it applicable for diverse individuals. Allowing students to connect to a topic of learning to their specific passion most obviously makes that learning more interesting for the student, but it also makes it more understandable because it's linking it to something that they already comprehensively understand. For both of those reasons, students are then able to learn the content better and be more successful in their personal undertakings. Secondly, to make learning more applicable and relatable to students, you can connect it across different subjects areas. In primary school, all learning is interdisciplinary, involving many different components. And this is a more real way to understand how learning accesses the real world through multiple mediums. However, once we get to high school, we see that these subjects are split into different classes. And while this allows more specialised learning, it is also a trade-off between having interdisciplinary connection between these subjects. Students all excel in different areas, and allowing the specific understanding to benefit them in areas that they're less fluent in allows a more rounded understanding of that subject also, and reminds them of the ever-present multiple angles you can take to any problem. One way we can incorporate this into our learning at Taroona High School is to have a topic every year that students can briefly study in every subject. This is a system currently used at Ogilvie High School, and a few years ago one of their topics was Macquarie Island. Students then, for example, were able to study literature based on the island in English, look at the animal populations and statistics in mathematics, and at Taroona High School we could even extend this to all subjects, applying it to things like painting the island in art, or students going on an island geography camp in outdoor education, to incorporate our own Taroona twist to this idea. While this idea would take broad systemic change, even on a personal level, within your own classroom, it can be beneficial to vaguely understand the learning of other subjects and potential overlap. This is as simple as a talk in the staff room, but could also involve a more comprehensive meeting between different learning areas. Thirdly, learning should never end when a student walks outside the classroom door. Particularly in troubled times like we've recently experienced, it is even more critical that learning in the classroom can relate to the current context of the outside world. When so much is going on in the student's world, it can be difficult to focus on learning in class. However, by no means does this mean that we need to block out outside current events. In fact, it is even more important that they are incorporated to stimulate conversations and help students understand what is happening in the world. Recently, I found this to be done in a few classes. For example, talking about the Black Lives Matter protests in humanities and looking at the coronavirus cases data as cumulative frequency graphs in mathematics. When something is physically happening, the learning feels so much more real and critical for students to learn. And what they learn can be immediately used and put into action to help them in their daily lives and be an active citizen of our society. To be successful, students don't just need to be able to ace a test. They need to be able to engage with the outside world and apply their knowledge in both the present day and the future. Finally, let's recall the purpose of school is to prepare students for their future, and as such, learning should be applicable for students to use in the future. Obviously, the national curriculum isn't in your personal control, but your presentation to students is. Presenting content with how it relates to a student's future helps students understand why content is actually important and relevant to them, ultimately increasing their engagement. Making content relatable to a student's future can mean anything from explaining how understanding compound interest will help them paying off a credit card, to how understanding a specific chemical formula might be beneficial for a student wishing to go forth and study medicine. Talking about a student's future with them can additionally provide necessary dialogue for the student to set goals for their future and have an understanding of where they wish to end up. Having goals makes students more directed in their learning, and while by no means is it essential to have your life planned by 16, it is beneficial to know what interests you and the kind of areas that you wish to pursue. Teachers play a guiding role in this journey of discovery and students finding their own paths to success. We've talked generally about how making learning applicable and relatable to students benefits them broadly, but let's instead take a moment to look deeper at how applicable learning helps four distinct demographics of students that we may encounter in the classroom. I've categorised these broad groups as struggling students, high achievers, unmotivated students, and floaters, as I'll explain later. Firstly, struggling students can find learning difficult for a complex variety of reasons. If you allow me to oversimplify and generalise, these students don't understand the learning content. Often learning can seem quite abstract and complex to a challenged student. However, when we tie it back to things that they already know and understand, for example, simple daily actions or previous learning, it can reveal and help them learn the important fundamentals. It is also incredibly important to note that no student is a two-dimensional label. These struggling students hold deeper complexities and different insights which can be tapped into for learning. For example, a student may have a part-time job supporting their family, and classroom learning can be applied to discount at a cash register. Or maybe the student really struggles to conceptualise history, but is super interested in motor vehicles. So we can tie the historical timeline for them to understand it on the basis of how it affected the release of different car models. High achievers generally understand classroom content pretty easily, but as a teacher it is important to continue and extend their learning. When we push high achievers, for example in above standard questions and tests, we see that we ask them to apply their learning to the real world. For example, by calculating the volume of a tank to fill, or by connecting it to the historical context of the current day, test. This is further thinking for the student, but it isn't a meaningless extra worksheet because it is actively extending and applying their thinking. This is how we should strive for all students to be exploring the applied knowledge of their learning. In addition, these really motivated and already successful students are often very busy, so explaining why a particular task is applicable to life and important to know will also help it move up their priority list. On the other side of the spectrum, we see completely unmotivated students, who regardless of capabilities, don't feel like doing any work. To understand this, let's first look at why we do anything. Because of incentives or disincentives. Let's focus on incentives. Sorry. These students evidently aren't incentivised by grades or current school-based incentives. So showing students how the learning can be applied to the real world provides a new incentive for these students, as learning being something that can help them in impactful ways in their daily life or future. Furthermore, subjects can engage them in more stimulating ways by relating to their personal interests. The final broad demographic of students is floaters. These students are just cruise through their school happily achieving average marks and jumping through the hoops. These students can broadly benefit in all the above categories, gaining passion in the subject by connecting it to an interest and improving their understanding of the learner's place in the world and their own future. This not only makes learning more engaging now, but also gives students planning and clarity towards their future and readiness for life. Meaning that by making the learning applicable through all these means, we are encouraging and supporting these students to be successful. As demonstrated in these four broad student demographics, making learning more applicable and relatable to students will ultimately benefit not only their engagement in their learning now, but will help draw them on these skills as an adult in the workforce. Learning is fascinating in the way it shapes our understanding and knowledge of the world. As teachers, you have the marvellous and unique role to pass on your knowledge to students. Everyone learns in different ways and have different incentives, but the common theme that I've heard echoed is that how learning being applicable makes content feel more real and easy to understand. As a teacher, with your deep knowledge of your subject, it may seem obvious why learning is important, but for students it's more difficult to comprehend. The four broad ways we make learning relatable that I've discussed are connecting it to students' passions, interdisciplinary learning, context of current world events, and an explanation of how learning will be used in the future. What it boils down to is that for students to be successful, they need to understand and engage with learning content. To achieve this, they need three things. Firstly, to understand the content. Secondly, to find it interesting. And finally, to understand why it's important. And all of these are achieved by making learning relatable and applicable for those students. To conclude, I'd like to leave you with a quote by the educational psychologist and founder of outcome-based education, or goal setting, William Spavey. All students can learn and succeed, but not in the same way and not in the same day.